And good afternoon, everybody. This is Marcus Hanscom. I'm the Director of Graduate Admission at Roger Williams University up in Rhode Island, and we're having nice, beautiful weather for once. So welcome, and I'm actually your outgoing technology chair, so I'm still kind of holding the reins for a little while here. And I want to welcome you to our latest webinar. It's called The Personal Side of Leadership, and I'll introduce our speakers in just a second. You'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen that you have a questions box. So if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to enter them there, and we'll be happy to have those answered at the end of the session for you by each of the panelists. So just to let me know that you can hear us, if you could just go into the questions box and just say hi or something, that would be great, so we know. And if you have any trouble with hearing any of the speakers or seeing screens, just let me know that that's working for you, or you have any trouble, and we'll be happy to fix that for you. And it looks like everybody can hear me, so that's great. Thanks so much for letting us know. And so we'll get moving further here. And without any further ado, I will introduce our three speakers. If for any of you who went to NAGAP in Nashville this year, you may have seen this session. It was very popular, so hence why we're bringing it back in a webinar format. And it has one of the largest registration lists we've had of a webinar, so clearly there's a lot of interest in this topic. So it's the personal side of leadership. And the three panelists you have here today, you have first Linda Horrisk. She's our outgoing NAGAP Education Chair and recently just finished up at Fordham University Graduate School of Education. Josh Lefebvre is the Executive Director of Division of Graduate and Continuing Education at SUNY Potsdam in upstate New York. And we've got Dave Fletcher. He's the Senior Director of Graduate Admission at Barry University. So I'm going to pass it off to Josh, and thanks so much for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Marcus, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're dialing in from. We're so pleased that you were able to join us today. I think there's another slide, Dave. We're going to, yep, there we go. So really just briefly before we talk a little bit about the goals of the session, I just wanted to mention that we did do this at the NAGAP annual conference. So those of you that came out early in the morning on a Saturday, if you are joining us again, thank you so much. But I think leadership in general is such a large topic. Even narrowing it down to a conversation about the personal side of leadership really is just so much. So we're only scratching the surface today, and our hope for all of you that are attending is that you'll be able to take some of this, not only to help with reflection of yourself as a leader or someone that might be going into a leadership position, but it's also just a reflection of how you can implement some of these practices and really think about them as it relates to who you are as a professional and as a person, as a reflected practitioner, but also maybe provide you with some tools that you can use when you're really trying to work to improve various not just aspects of the office, but more importantly, trying to develop your people. And that's what the goals of this session are going to be. So briefly, some of the overarching goals today, you're going to hear about three distinct conversations of leadership. We're going to examine multiple perspectives that shape reflection and growth as a leader, share practical steps that can help. Oh, okay, if we could go back to that slide. Sorry about that, everyone.
Is this the one we want? Sorry.
Yeah. Share practical steps that can help you to implement these approaches. Emphasize that leadership is first about the person, not the organization or job. And we don't go into detail about the differences between management and leadership. That's not the goals here. The goal is to really talk about you. But it's really about you first. And then once you develop who we are as leaders and as professionals, the rest comes with that. Offer alternative approaches that may help you to overcome personal challenges, and ultimately a toolkit to examine who you are as a leader. So we really have a lot to do in the next hour. Hopefully, if we do go over, some of you will be able to join us, but this will be recorded, so you will have an opportunity to watch this in whole or in part. So the first segment of the presentation, I believe, you go ahead, Dave, is going to be being a reflective leader. Think about why, how, and what you do. Then we're going to move into other topics that really tie nicely into this particular session. So what I'm going to do now is give this right over to Linda Horrisk, who's going to talk about the reflective leader, and really kind of take notes and think about some of the things that are being said that have common themes across the different sessions that you're going to hear from myself as well as Dave, and really try to tie. The goal of this is that you'll be able to tie a lot of this together, which we'll talk about in the wrap-up. But for now, Linda, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be back involved with professional development again with our NAGAP colleagues. And just to let you know that what I'm going to be focusing on being a reflective leader is to encourage you to figure some things out, do some very deep self-reflection, figure things out about yourself, who you are as a person, as a worker, as a leader, and how these interactions that you have with each of those three personas, how do those interactions help you to move people forward in your work? And one of the bits of information that I will be sharing with you is something that I took from the Leadership Challenge by Cousy and Posner, is that leadership is not about having a title. So for those of you who are involved in this webinar today, some of you might have titles of leadership, others may not, but know that everyone is a leader no matter what you're doing within an organization. Okay, next slide, please. So what I'll be talking about the most is kind of building on your own authenticity. Being an authentic leader is something that we hear a lot about, as well as being an authentic person. And the only way that you can really do that is through reflection and being very mindful of who you are, what's motivating you, your external environment. It's almost like you're having a Socratic dialogue within your head, you versus you, and then helping you to discover things about yourself so that you can help to move yourself as well as your organization forward. So when we look at this quote here about leadership development, it's first and foremost a very important thing, but also that we have to develop a whole person. Next slide, please. So when we think about reflection, I mean, I don't know how many of you on the call today are former educators, or any of you who do any teaching in your jobs now. For example, I know that Josh has his position of a senior director up there in Potsdam, New York, but he also teaches graduate courses as well in leadership. So when we think about teaching and learning, you know, a lot of us reflect back to the works of John Dewey, who is kind of the one of the patron saints of education here in the United States. And so if you look at the quotes that are here, you know, reflection enables us to know what we are about when we act. It allows individuals to think critically and scientifically. We hear a lot these days about the need for young people in schools to become more critical thinkers, and this whole process of reflection can help you to do that. And I will give you some steps that you can take as takeaways from this presentation today. And so when you make your reflection intentional, it becomes what we call a habit of mind. And when we think about this whole concept of habits of mind, these are things that we do and we embed them into daily practice so that they become a habit that we're not really thinking about, oh, I have to do this today, but rather we are just doing them. It's a much higher level of thinking that we're talking about here. It's the analysis and synthesis, that those of you who are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, that whole part of learning and internalizing one's environment and being able to be, quote unquote, more intellectual, smarter, and savvy about your environments and learning and the people with whom you work. But it's definitely at a much higher level than just learning something by rote and moving forward with it. This whole idea of reflection is a very personal journey. So in essence, you can move the slide while I'm speaking here. In essence, we're not just talking about, okay, so I'm thinking about my day and why did I do this and why did I do that? What we're doing is we're peeling back the layers and looking at the why. And I would strongly suggest, if you're taking notes here, to jot down the name of Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K, and take a look at some of his videos that are on YouTube, especially the one where he talks about finding the why. I think that you'll find that really interesting. And so what we find, too, are characteristics of reflective practitioners. They know how to make meaning out of things, whether it's an event. It's kind of like an ongoing inquiry that you have with yourself when you're reflective. And what we know now about brain research that we didn't know when some of us involved in this webinar today were young professionals is that we didn't quite know as well how the brain works, but we know so much more now through brain research as well as through PET scans where, people are learning while they're hooked up and their brains are hooked up, and we actually can see from the colors on the computer screens which area of the brains are lighting up at different times. So it's absolutely fascinating. And so when we think about how the brain works, it works much better when it's making meaning out of something. And this is, of course, a big challenge for anyone who's teaching pre-K through 12 as well as in higher education as well. And it helps us because we're always learning in our jobs in higher ed. Well, actually yours, now that I did the big retired word last week. So please do keep that in mind on how that process kind of works. And so there are two ways that you can reflect, as you can see from the screen that you're looking at. We reflect in action or on action. So inaction occurs while you're doing it. So you're involved in a particular task or you're in a meeting and you're trying to create a mission statement and you're thinking, you're monitoring and adjusting as you go along. You're trying to help other people to make meaning and yourself simultaneously. So it's a really challenging environment. And then sometimes our reflection is at the end of the day or at the end of the week where we are, okay, how did things go? Let me really think about, well, I had this meeting the other day and how well did that go and why? So it's really important for us. What we find is this is what is sometimes referred to as double loop learning, where you're critically examining underlying values and then bringing that to some kind of change or new learning. Next slide, please. And so when we think about what influences meaningful reflection, if you could just take a quick scan of some of the things that are on that list. Generally, in an in-person session, we would be asking to hear what you thought might be influencers. But from what you can see here, these are influencers, which we kind of get the idea that they're coming from the outside, but they're also lenses that people look at themselves and look at learning and change with. They're looking through the lens of their particular culture, or they're looking through the lens of generational differences. You can go to the next slide. And so speaking of generational differences, I find this one to be a particularly fascinating topic, which is why I went a little deeper into this when I was doing my research. But I took one of the quotes from Dr. Levine. For those of you who are on the call and who were at the conference, you might remember our keynote speaker, Dr. Levine, formerly of Columbia University, and who is now with the Eisenhower Foundation and MIT, where they're involved in a joint project to kind of reinvent higher ed, so to speak. And so he said technology is something that was developed before you were born. Deliberate pause here for some think time. And so when we think about how technology has affected our lives, we would say that probably technology is an influencer for leadership, for how people are in the workshop, in the workplace. And we think of these sometimes as being divided into different generational gaps. And so how do we deal with those in the workplace? Next slide, please. And so when you take a look here at some of the different generations, starting from what are called seniors, right on up to the Gen Zers, and you see, descriptors of how they communicate, how they problem solve. And then you look at their technology use, and we see that people born more recently just can't picture life without technology. However, it's so interesting to know, even though there are lots of differences that you see among the different generations here, what Kuzis and Posner found in some of their more recent research, because they have been doing research on leadership for over 30 years. Both of them had their careers at Santa Clara Era University, which is a Jesuit university in California. And you know that Posner was one of our speakers at NAGAP in 2014. And then he also spoke for the JGAP meeting that we had in the fall of 2014 as well. And so when they did their research, what they did is they asked people to do, and I think we can flip to the next slide here. Next slide. Okay, no, go back, or we get too far, one step ahead of myself there. So what they did with their research was that they asked people to describe their personal best stories. And then they looked for similarities in personal best stories. So that was part of more of their qualitative research. The quantitative looked at other kinds of, hard data. But what they found in the soft data was that there were certain characteristics of leadership that emerged. And although when they did this similar kind of study more recently, although the context of leadership changed. So if you're still looking at your chart there, you see some of the different kinds of things that different generations were facing. However, the content of leadership, the true truths about what people were looking for in a leader and what leaders themselves thought were very important to them in their work, they remain the same over the 30-year span. So I thought it would be very important for you to keep that in mind if you're dealing with some generational issues in your workplace. Now we can go to the next slide, please. So another thing that Kouzes and Posner do build into their work, and it is very much built into, now I worked in a school of education, so reflection is a huge part of teaching and learning, of counseling. Those were programs that I had in my school, as well as leadership study as well for school districts and for schools, as well as for higher education. And so, of course, mine being in a Jesuit school, they focused a lot on the teachings of Ignatius Loyola. And what he purported was that we had to look at what we believed in, not what we think that we should believe in all of the time. Believe it or not, okay, a person of the religious persuasion believing in something like that. So it's feeling that it would bring you to a new sense of knowing yourself and of spirituality as well. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, an Ignatian spirituality study showed, after interviewing 20 senior managers, that the researchers noted, after their self-reflection, look at the things there on the slide that had noted positive effects in their workplace. Decision-making, organizational mission, social responsibility, that goes beyond the workplace, career development, and the meaning of work. Next slide, please. And so some of the conclusions of the study showed that by doing reflections, that people helped to make people were more involved in decision making as well as teamwork. The leaders were more concerned about the whole person and not just you in your work environment, that when you come into the workplace each day, you leave your baggage at the door. When I was a school administrator, I can remember using that line a lot with teachers, and trying to have them be more empathetic with their students by remembering that everybody comes in the door every morning with some baggage, and we have to be attuned to what that is. Next slide, please. So if you're thinking of incorporating reflection into your work, just trying to give you here some ideas of some questions that you might ask yourself at the end of each day. And always, please start with the positive every single day on your way home. Think about something good that happened so that you not only give meaning, but you kind of set the stage for being reflective, as well as, not bringing yourself down in the dumps by the one thing that happened or the one meeting that you attended. So look at, what was the high point, the low point of your day. When did you feel that you were your best? And then, looking forward, what other kinds of goals might you want to do, or how might you do something differently or what really worked and why. If we could skip 2 slides now, we'll get to right where we want to be. And that is, I thought that this was a good quote from the works of Kuzis and Posner to share with you from their Leadership Challenge book. You don't have to look up for leadership. You don't have to look out. You only have to look inward. I almost felt like I was sounding like Dr. Seuss there for a moment. But it is a recurring theme in reflection, and especially from these authors. But you know, they both firmly believed that you would not learn about leadership by only reading books about how to manage, how to lead, because the main thing in leadership is who you are as a person, so that then leadership becomes really an expression of the art that is you. Next slide, please. So you might have heard me mention earlier that one thing that they based their research on was interviewing people about their personal best stories. And so they found some common threads and top characteristics like honesty, competency, being forward-looking, being inspiring, and being credible as a leader, that these were the top characteristics across nations and across continents. And because they reverberated so much, that became really the basis for their thinking about leadership. So our next slide shows us the 5 practices of exemplary leadership. And I'll just mention the first 2, model the way and inspire a shared vision, because those both involved reflection. If we could go to that next page, please. So when you're modeling the way, you're clarifying your values, that's that reflection piece. You're also setting an example. You're walking the talk, and people need to see that. You're creating shared values. You're kind of checking on yourself all of the time after you have uncovered your personal values, and you're going to, you know, be the person that your colleagues will look up to. And this is who you are, whether you are in a leadership position or whether you are a member of a staff and you're involved in any way in discussions about the future and how you can reach the goals that you've set. Next slide, please. Okay, and then when you are inspiring a shared vision, you're going to rely on your internal compass and your dream. And when we think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, I mean, he didn't get up there and tell millions of people that he had a plan. A plan would indicate that there was a script. This is what we're going to do. We're going to do A, B, and C, and we're going to reach Z because that is our goal. But rather, he described what that dream is. And so when you're thinking about planning and goal setting, think of it first as a dream and get people to buy in and have them be involved in helping to make the plan. What does the dream look like? And then the avenues that we will take in order to get there. And then you have checkpoints along the way so that you can check on your progress toward it. So, you know, probably some of you are imagining, you know, your admissions funnel, because we eat and sleep and walk and talk our admissions funnels all the time. But again, you want to build some kind of a common purpose with people that with whom you're working, so that you can achieve these goals in a different way. Now, I know that sometimes some of this stuff sounds very fuzzy, but you know, when you were a 60s person like I was, you know, everything had that kind of fuzziness to it because you wanted to be working on creating it. And the reflection will help you to do that. And I'll just end this one slide with one thing that Kuzis and Posner said, is that leaders see open doors while others see brick walls. And the next slide, please. And so what are your takeaways or next steps from what I've shared with you? I'll let you take a look at this list, and perhaps you can pick something, 1 or 2 things from here as your takeaway, and things that you can work on, whether it is your own self-reflection, whether you do some blogging or writing, trying to engage others in a conversation. Maybe there's someone you can partner with, workplace, forward. Now I just would like to turn this over to one of my colleagues.
Josh or Dave, you guys there?
This is Dave. I'm here. Josh is up
Yep,
next.
I'm up next, and something happened to my phone, but I think it's fixed. So now we're going to talk a little bit about emotions, and hopefully everyone has had a chance to take some good notes so we can start to make some circular references here. But what I want to talk about is how leading with emotional intelligence, and I'm sure many of you have heard the topic before and maybe know a little bit about it. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to provide just a cursory look at what it is and really kind of understand why we wanted to bring it into this conversation. Is one of my firm beliefs that leadership, the base of leadership, is interaction. Leadership, by definition, is about influencing change by the use of power. Power is often viewed in a lot of different ways, but part of all of that is tied into this whole connection piece, this human emotion and connection. So take away titles, take away your professional life, and really think about, as I'm talking through this session, don't think about your professional life solely. Think about your interactions in general. Maybe it's for different organizations that you volunteer for, or other different opportunities, or even your personal lives with your family. Think about those interactions as we're talking through some of this, the PowerPoint today. So let's dive right in. Go ahead, Dave, to the next slide. One of my favorite quotes, we all tend to use quotes as a way to kind of give context, is the greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. Next slide. So what are emotions anyway?
Let's see.
Oh, you can just go back. It's fine. So when we actually presented in person, we had videos and we had audio clips. So we're going to try and skip through most of that. But as you saw, one of the things I did is, when we think about emotions, a lot of times we think on the surface. And when we think on the surface, we think of, people crying, or we think about that feeling of love and affection. So that's why I threw up the Mariah Carey and the Aerosmith, because they both have songs about emotions. But looking at just a song about emotions is kind of my analogy, is just looking at the surface, right? So emotion, by definition, is a mental state that arises spontaneously rather than through conscious effort, and is often accompanied by physiological changes or a feeling. So we're not even, take away the whole idea of emotional intelligence. Now we're just talking about emotion, right? So that's the definition. We're talking about it's something that happens spontaneously. It's part of who we are. It's our DNA. We react to everything. And the way that we react is through emotion. Next slide. So if we think about basic emotions, so many of us probably think, oh, well, there's hundreds of different types of emotions, and there's all of these different ways that we can express ourselves. If you click the button again, Dave, once, what you'll see is these, after all of the research, these are the presumed hardwired and physiologically distinctive, physiologically meaning you can see it, right, emotions that we as humans have. We have joy. Now, joy can be described in lots of other kind of subcategories, if you will. And they're all tied into these different phases, right? Surprise, and surprise is linked to a lot of different things. We talk about fight or flight. We talk about the reactions that we have and what we do when we're surprised, and the physiological changes that happen when we get scared. Sadness, anger, disgust, and fear. So there are sub-emotions, if you will, under there. But think about how many different times you could tell if somebody had joy, if somebody was sad, if somebody was angry. How many times could you tell with them not saying a word? And that goes back to that whole definition of emotion and the physiological change. We naturally do that. Some of us do it a little bit more distinctly than others. Some people try to hide their emotion, but it's really hard as humans to hide that emotion. And think about that as we get into the concept of emotional intelligence. What does that mean as a leader, right? What does that mean when we recognize emotions within ourselves and within others? Next slide. So we're going to get a little nerdy, if you will, for a minute, and I want to just kind of briefly go over what does it mean when we talk about where emotions in terms of where does it come from. Obviously we have our facial expressions and whatnot, but what does it really mean? And just briefly, so emotions are produced and experienced in the brain's limbic system, and there's just a nice little diagram there for you. Emotional impulses travel from the limbic system to the front of the brain where rational, logical thinking can take place. So let's kind of think about that for a minute. So before rational thought is in place, our limbic system is developed before our frontal lobe, our frontal limbic system. So that's why if you think about a baby, or you think about our terrible twos, and all of these emotions are natural. You're born with them. And the ability to rationalize how you feel, or to think about your reaction and maybe not react in a way your body wants to, that develops second. So if we are, based on our experiences in our lives, if we have a difficult time processing emotions because it happens automatically, if we can't keep that in check, that's where we may act irrationally. And while we all have, the frontal limbic or the frontal lobe and all of that, we have those things. And sometimes we haven't had an opportunity to develop it, or we haven't been reflecting enough to really think about what does that emotion mean for me. So I just wanted to share that with you, because if we think about, for those of you that have children, when they were born and growing up, how often they resorted to crying or tears before really understanding what happened. I can think about last night. My daughter wanted a piece of chocolate, and you've already had enough chocolate. I think we're good. Next thing you know, it's a full-out cry. She's also 2, so that's probably to be expected. But there's an example of that connection between the limbic system and your brain's ability for rational and logical thought. Next slide. So emotions are the foundation of everything, especially as we talk about emotional intelligence in the context of the personal side of leadership. They just happen. And how we perceive the world around us is based on our emotions. Emotions happen is based on our perceptual experience. So we talk, for those of you that might have done Myers-Briggs and the whole personality test and things like that, one of their arguments is that, our personalities we're born with, but how we interpret the world based on those is how we react. And it's really tied in with emotions as well. So it's how we perceive the world around us. Based on our experiences, I'm going to react something differently to the same situation than Dave might, or Linda, or Marcus, or anybody else on the call that I know. We all react to the same thing different, but it's contagious. Here is the key when we start to get into the conversation around leadership. They're the most hyper-efficient mode of communication. As I talked about earlier, they need no words. I know if someone's upset, I know if someone's sad, or I know if I made somebody laugh, or somebody, want to laugh, or what have you. Positive emotions. One of the arguments that Daniel Goleman, one of the really the fathers of emotional intelligence research and publications, says that positive emotions spread more powerfully than bad ones. And what the word that I wanted to take away from everything we talk about is this concept of resonance. Resonance brings out everyone's best. So when we talk about, we're not talking about it in this particular presentation, but there's different types of leadership. And some of you might have heard of the concept of emergent leadership. This is somebody who people want to follow. They are not put in a position. They're not put in a state where, people have to because that's part of their job, or because they're a dictator, or what have you. They want to follow somebody because they connect with them. They believe in what they're saying and doing. They're creating this concept of positive resonance, this positive emotional feeling. And think about that in your lives. If somebody created this positive emotional connection with you, and it doesn't have to be in a romantic way, but just perhaps in another way. Maybe you look up to certain types of people. What is it about them that makes you want to listen to what they have to say, or take orders or direction from them? Is it based on their title, or is it based on because of the way that they present themselves, the decisions that they make that are based upon positive resonance? So not to drive this home again, but think about this word as we talk about emotional intelligence and why people follow others. Some would argue, someone that's a really compassionate speaker or a very good speaker, people start to feel that positive resonance because their emotions are in tune with what's being said. Okay? Next slide. So, out-of-control emotions can make smart people act dumb. And think about some of the times that maybe you have made irrational decisions, or you have reacted irrationally, or you have seen it. We see this a lot, whether it's on TV, in politics, maybe we see this with people that we work with. It happens, and it's really nothing we can do about it. Or is there? So the argument of emotional intelligence is that by reflecting on who we are, understanding what our triggers are and what we struggle with, helps us to keep our emotions in check so that the rest of our brain can catch up, so to speak, and help make a more rational decision. And some of us have our own ways of trying to deal with that, but today's goal is to provide you with an overview of some of the things that to be on the lookout for and what we can try to do about it. Next slide. So remember this, it's not what we don't know, it's what we think we know. And if we don't know, we get scared. If we don't know the answer to something, we either get scared, we shut down, or we build stories to fill the gap. We create what we call mental models, right? So we have these, we're standing ground with what we think is true because we don't want to necessarily acknowledge that we don't know something, because that would make us look bad to our superiors, right? I mean, if we just don't know something, we can either say, I don't know, and go look it up and really kind of process that. But as humans, we naturally do this. We build stories to fill the gap and can miss critical information. We shut ourselves down. We don't have this rational thought. We're working on emotion. So we might miss critical information of our surroundings that could help to come to a viable solution. So again, it's all about how we perceive the world. Think of moments that you create answers before you have them, and how we perceive and interpret the world defines how we adopt and cope. So very simple example, how many of you have gotten an email from somebody and thought, well, that was rude, or what's his problem? What's her problem? Well, the simple example is somebody reacted based on emotion, not thinking and rationalizing. I often pick on someone who tends to send an email with an exclamation point at the end of every sentence. And I think about that, and he means nothing by that. That's just how he is. That's how he interprets typing in an email. So very simple example, but because of how we're conditioned to read, or how we're conditioned to look at an email based on who we are and our makeup, somebody could be thinking they're just sending a very direct, professional email, and we might look at it as like, what's their problem? So there's just a simple example of that whole shaping of our world and interpretation and how our emotions react to things. Next slide. Great leaders move us. They ignite our passion and inspire the best in us. When we try to explain why they are so effective, we speak of strategy, vision, and powerful ideas. But the reality is much more primal. Great leadership works through emotions. And that's coming from a book I would encourage you to look, if you want to look into this further. It's called Primal Leadership by Daniel Goleman. And that's really where a lot of the basis of all of this comes from. Next slide. So let's dive into emotional intelligence. We talked about our emotions. We know where they come from. We know how we react to them based on all of this. Let's actually get into the concept of emotional intelligence. Next slide. So it is defined as your ability to recognize and understand emotions in yourself and others, and your ability to use this awareness to manage your behavior and the relationships of those around you. So again, it is about yourself in the world and how you interact with others in the world. Next slide. So EQ is often referred to in terms of emotional intelligence, and that's about I feel, okay? And then, of course, we all know IQ, I think. So IQ scores may predict a person's success in technical, academic areas. A lot of research suggests that you're born with it, but it does not predict success in interactions or decision-making situations. You could be the smartest person in the room, but not know how to convey yourself appropriately, and that's where emotional intelligence comes into play. Next slide. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. Just notice that it's almost quarter of here. So again, we talk about the IQ does not change over time. It's very stable over a lifetime. Emotional intelligence, on the other hand, is very flexible. You're able to change. You're able to learn and understand and adapt and really reflect on some of the specifics of emotional intelligence to improve your interaction with the world, but also how you can build relationships with others. And then the third piece to this I like this diagram because I mentioned it earlier about personality. Research suggests that IQ and personality is something that you're born with. So that whole argument about are leaders born or are they made depends on your perspective. So IQ is something that certainly is helpful. Personality, certainly helpful as well. But your personality is your personality. And you can adopt your personality and tie it into emotional intelligence to help you with the interaction. While you might not be able to change your personality, you can improve the way you interact, how your personality interacts with others. And that's where emotional intelligence comes into play. Next slide. So real quick differences. IQ measures cognitive intelligence, your ability to learn, skill, use of reason, where EQ measures emotional intelligence and your ability to use emotions and cognitive skills. And of course, these are just some of the other kind of ways to look at and describe it. You have book smart versus head smart, so on and so forth. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to go over the 4 components in a short amount of time here. Again, you can always look at the video and the slides afterwards. But the 2 areas are personal competencies and social competencies. And in each of those 2 areas, we have self-awareness and self-management in the personal. And under social, we have social awareness and relationship management. These are the 4 competencies in emotional intelligence. So again, remember, personal is all about you and your interaction with the world, how you interact with the world, and how the world interacts with you is the social competency piece. So those are the 4 that we're going to cover real quick. Next slide. So we have the 4 competencies, which I've shared, and we're not going to go into these into detail. I would encourage you to read more about this. But then there are 21 domains, and these domains are basically descriptors within each of the core 4 areas. So as an example, with self-awareness, what makes up self-awareness is emotional self-awareness, accurate self-assessment, and personal power. So again, power is tied to leadership. Other awareness would be empathy, service ethic, organizational awareness when it comes to others. But this is a good way to kind of show you briefly those 21 domains, again, that Goldman mentions, because we have to, it's one thing to say self-awareness, but what exactly does that mean and what does that look like? And here are some of the examples of what that really is. And again, I'm happy to go into more detail at another time if anyone wants to, but these characteristics define how we manage self-awareness in terms of the component of emotional intelligence. Next slide. Okay, personal competence. I am indeed a king because I know how to rule myself. And I love that quote because it's really what it's about. Next slide. So the first of these is the personal emotional intelligence. Self-awareness is the first domain. Self-awareness is the ability to accurately perceive your own emotions and motives. What are your values? What are your motives? What triggers do you have? You have to know the difference between feelings and actions. All feelings are acceptable, but not all actions. And that has to do with this awareness piece. You may feel like you want to slug your boss, but you know you shouldn't. Recognize that others are mirrors for ourselves. What's my role in it? The whole idea of neurobiology of authenticity sounds very scientific, but really what all that's saying is that whole idea of, am I my authentic self? Can I, at the end of the day, go home and say my interaction, the way I felt, my interaction with others was who I was. I didn't let other people make decisions for me. Okay, and then developing a personal mission statement. So if we think about a mission statement, it's who I am. Next slide. Self-awareness skills enable you to know what you do well, what motivates you, what satisfies you, and what pushes your buttons. You know you're a lamp because you're looking at yourself and you see that you're a lamp, right? Next slide. I'm sorry, Dave, I'm going to hurry up here. Self-awareness at work. Leaders with high self-awareness, let's tie this into your work, make sound decisions regarding their responses to people and situations. They're highly self-reliant and self-motivated, and effectively respond to the range of interpersonal reactions encountered in the workplace. So think about your day if you have 8 different meetings, and all of those meetings are about different topics, different subjects, and different people. How you interact, if you're aware of how you're interacting with those different populations is really what this is about. Okay? So that's some self-awareness in leaders at work. Next slide. So to build self-awareness, going back to that reflection piece, Identify your values and intentions. And a lot of times you can take self-assessments, strengths quest as an example of one. What are your values? What are things that are important to you? And what is your intention in terms of your career? Physically feel your emotions. Acknowledge your true feelings, and make time for reflection. In my leadership class, as an example, I make a high percentage of their grade based upon a journal that they write that demonstrates reflection in themselves based on the things they're learning and the activities that they're doing. And that is really how we can grow to understand not only what it is that we're learning, but how it applies to us and examples of times that we've used it. Seek feedback from people you trust, and like I mentioned earlier, learn about your hot buttons and triggers. Next slide. Self-management. We have self-awareness as part 1 of 2 of the personal competencies. Now into self-management. Self-control, self-management, the ability to effectively manage your emotions and your behaviors. Next slide. It enables you to tolerate uncertainty as you work through your emotions, resist momentary emotional needs in order to pursue more important goals, remain flexible, and direct your behavior in a positive way. And instead of being mad about a situation, maybe you go on and do something else for a while, instead of maybe yelling at somebody or complaining in front of the people that work for you. Because remember, we talk about positive resonance versus negative resonance, and if you can manage your emotions in a positive way so that people don't see you're struggling, right? That's really what this is about. How can I manage my emotions to keep things positive, to not affect others, and to try to prevent any kind of negative communication, verbal or nonverbal? Okay. Next slide. At work, leaders with high self-management skills keep disruptive impulses in check. They maintain standards of honesty and integrity, take responsibility for one's performance, effectively manage change, and are adaptable. Okay, so self-management in terms of not just how you manage change of the whole area, but how are you managing that change with yourself, right? How are you working through that? And I'll skip that quote now. You're able to read that later. Next slide. As far as strategies with self-management, taking a few deep breaths. Maybe some people, they write out how they feel. That helps them, or maybe they write out a list of the things they need to fix with whatever issue that's there. Try to get both sides of a situation. That happened recently here. I can tell you somebody that is in my area. There were some issues, and I talked to the other side of that to try and understand and really kind of think about and really process how I felt about it by listening to everything. Recognize the situation is temporary. I tell people all the time, a year from now, nobody will remember this problem because it's not that significant, right? There's a great book out there called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And that was probably one of the best books that I ever read because I used to let everything bother me. And at the end of the day, I was like, you know what? In a year from now, no one's going to remember that this happened. And we're going to move on from it. Use positive self-talk or a mantra and take a break. Maybe shut the door to your office. Go for a walk. Go get a coffee. There are a lot of things that we can do to kind of blow off that steam. Next slide. Social competencies is really about your interactions with others. So we'll go to the next slide there. Social awareness is the ability to acutely understand the emotions and concerns of others. There's a great video there I would encourage you to watch that talked about the time at 9/11 where George Bush spoke up and he said the statement, the world hears you, we hear you, and soon the people that did this will hear from all of us. And that was exactly what he needed to say at that time, is what people needed to build that positive resonance. Whether or not you believe or agree with George Bush as the president, that is the perfect example of social awareness, understanding what people around you need. Next slide. Social awareness enables you to understand other people's feelings and perspectives, people's development and support needs, social climates and group dynamics, and the concerns of diverse groups. So considering others' perspectives, getting everybody involved, thinking about, if I say or do this, how is that person going to react? Or what will happen? I can tell you a lot of times if we think about that, we might do or say something differently. If you understand the triggers of others, you may approach them differently. There's a really great book that talks about reframing organizations and people's frames and perspectives, and that's really what this is talking about. In order to accomplish common goals, we may need to approach things differently with each individual that we interact with. Next slide. And according to Daniel Goleman, the competencies associated with this are empathy, organizational awareness, and service. Okay, right? That whole concept of servant leadership and understanding people. Not sympathy, but empathy. Next slide. Leaders with high social awareness sense organizational tensions, changes, and needs. They understand team members' emotional triggers, and they develop trust and build lasting relationships. We all have a lot to do. We all have a lot of expectations on us. But taking a few minutes to stop and say, how's your son? How's your dad? Or I heard you went and did this last week. How did that go? People need to know that you're human. They need to know that you don't think about work 100% of the time, because work is there. But understanding people and how to motivate and trigger and understand, that's how to get the most out of people. Next slide. Building social awareness is practice active listening. You don't need to always be the one talking. Watch body language. Understand the whole picture. Consider the needs of individuals and groups, and really increase the sensitivity of social justice and harmony. And for God's sakes, greet people by name. Next slide. Okay, and then I'm going to real quickly, relationship management, the last of the four, is about the ability to inspire, influence, and develop relationships with others. And this is the most closely tied to that whole concept of building positive resonance. Next slide. Relationship management and building and managing relationships requires self-awareness. This is where it brings it all together, self-management and social awareness. This is really the core of all of this. Next slide. Leaders with strong relationship management, here's just a couple of examples. They communicate clearly, they get people involved, they respect other people's views, they encourage other people's views, and acknowledge the feelings associated with those. And I'll let you kind of skim through those quickly. As again, time, we go to the next slide. And as far as the resonance piece, remember that leaders influence the team's emotions. The team's emotions is what drives performance. Not their skills, not their technical abilities, but their emotions, because you are motivating them through their emotions to do their best. Next slide. And to wrap this up, the three key concepts, we have to know what triggers our emotional world. To wrap this up, leaders, we have to know what makes us angry, how do our feelings manifest in us, and we have to understand how to cope with our emotions. Next slide. And to wrap up, EI, especially self-awareness, is critical to create resonance, as I talked about. Emotional intelligence is made up of competencies that can be observed, assessed, learned, and developed. We have to be intelligent about our emotions and reflectively regulate our emotions so we can promote intellectual growth. And I will now turn it over to Dave.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. I appreciate that. We do have a few minutes left, and I'm going to try to hit some high points of the presentation. This part of the presentation is on servant leadership. I will be going through the slides very quickly and skipping those that are less than essential, so just bear with me. These first couple of slides are about the, it's like an outline to the presentation, so don't worry about those. But here's the definition of servant leadership. And the thing to focus on is just the first paragraph there. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve. That is the highest priority. One wants to serve first. And then a little bit of history. It's not exactly a new concept. Here you can see from a Chinese philosopher in the 6th century, especially the bottom paragraph there, the sage is self-effacing and scanty of words. When the task is accomplished and things have been completed, the people say, we ourselves have achieved it. So it's less about the leader and more about the group. And here another old philosopher quote from India in the 4th century. The king is a paid servant and enjoys the resources of the state together with the people. And then finally, something from the Christian Gospels where Jesus says, whoever wants to become the greatest among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the servant of all. Now this is a phrase, I'll skip it, it's a title that the Pope uses. It means the servant of the servants of God. It's still one of the official titles of the Pope, first used in the 600s. The Greenleaf Center, which is named for Robert Greenleaf, he founded it in the 70s, they point out, and this is a really crucial point, that servant leadership is both a philosophy and a practice. So it's not just a set of rules and it's not just a set of beliefs. It is both of those things together. The core parts, and I'm probably going to have to end with this, even though there's a bit more to the presentation, but if you get the PowerPoint, then you'll have all of these parts of it. The key points to servant leadership are that the leader puts the servant first, another Latin phrase, primus inter pares, which means first among equals. So it's a different kind of position of the leader. The leader uses their power not as power itself, but as influence and a way to embolden and give authority to the followers to increase their autonomy. And then leaders are stewards that hold the organization and its people in trust, so that the organization is well cared for, the goals of the organization are well met, but because the people themselves are the first priority. And back to the first point, what drives it all is the motivation to serve, not the motivation for power itself. Okay? The next slide here lists 10 characteristics of servant leadership. Listening, which emphasizes communication. Empathy, which is understanding others and their point of view. Healing, helping others to become whole. We never know what their situation is that they bring to us. Awareness of ourselves and the impact we have on others. Remember the reflective part that Linda spoke about. Persuasion, again, using our influence as influence, not as power. Conceptualization means being a visionary. Foresight, ability to predict what's happening based on what's currently present. Stewardship, managing the people, managing the organization, and holding it in trust for future generations. Commitment to the growth of people, treating them as they themselves have intrinsic value first, regardless of what they contribute to the organization. And then finally, building community and encouraging followers to identify with something greater than themselves. So it's already 2 o'clock. At this point, Marcus, I guess we need to end.
Yeah, Dave, we still have, and then we can continue if you'd like. There aren't any questions at the moment. We can certainly just stop and take any questions that there might be, but if you want to go on for another, maybe 10 minutes.
I'm happy to continue presenting if people want to stay on. I understand some people may have to leave.
Yeah, you might as well try to finish up if you'd like.
Okay, then I will continue that. So I just ran quickly through these characteristics, but here's another set of characteristics. One of the questions about servant leadership is the organization of it in general, and there are many philosophers out there, and one of the problems is that not everybody agrees on all of its characteristics. So this just gives a little chart of these various theorists and what they consider to be the key characteristics. And you will see that there is some overlap in some of these. For example, the first two on the left are Laub and Wong. They both refer to developing people, developing others, and so forth. So there seems to be some common characteristics, but different philosophers or different theorists have added different ones here and there. Now, this is a conceptual model of how servant leadership might actually work, and I'm going to flesh this out in the coming slides. So you'll see each section of this slide kind of enlarged in the next slides. So first of all, we begin with the motivation to become a servant leader, and there are 3 antecedents, or you might call them prerequisites, that go along with this. There's within the motivation, there is self-determination, and self-determination means that experience of a sense of choice in initiating and regulating your own actions. It's a feeling of competence, a feeling of connected to others, a feeling of autonomy. And when these feelings are satisfied, then there's an enhanced self-motivation, there's an enhanced mental health. And this self-determined person will be better in the way they use personal resources. They'll build stronger positive relationships. They will help others to develop their own self-determination. And so instead of exerting power by controlling and directing people in an authoritarian way, these leaders work from an integrative perspective, where power is not sought for its own sake, but it's used to provide others with the power to become self-determined. Moral cognitive development. This is development really from childhood to adulthood, where the person becomes aware of distinguishing between right and wrong. At the highest level, what really guides interactions is mutual respect, kind of the golden rule, we might say. And so at this level, we can imagine how things look from the perspective of the other person, and that becomes part of our decision process and our reasoning process. And then finally, cognitive complexity is the third prerequisite. And this is the person's ability to perceive social behavior in a differentiated fashion. So it allows for very specific judgment of social situations. It requires the servant leader to have a kind of a balancing act between providing direction and standing back and allowing others their own decisions and their own experience. It also means that we have to think beyond the present-day needs. We have to foresee the outcome of certain situations and be able to think through very conflicting and sometimes complex differences and situations. So the capacity for this cognitive complexity is directly related to being a positive servant leader. Okay, this sounds like some of the emotional intelligence that Josh has just spoken of. Right? Then in the context of the culture of the organization, there are some very important characteristics. I'll begin with the second one, which they call power distance. This refers to the extent to which a community accepts or endorses power differences and status privileges. For example, in a culture with a high power distance, one is expected to be very obedient to their authority figures, to elders and to leaders, to not question decisions that are made, to just do as the culture or society exists. And you might think of certain societies, we know this tends to be somewhat characteristic, for example, of Asian cultures. So large power differences here are expected and they're accepted. On the other hand, in a low power distance culture, decision-making is more decentralized. There's not such an emphasis on formal respect or deference. There's more a sense of community leadership. And so this is a culture where servant leadership might be more effective within an organization because the leader and the follower are on a more equal footing. In a situation like this, the leader would be less focused on self-protection and self-preservation. And because of the greater equality between the leader and the follower, there's a reciprocal relationship of personal growth that they can support each other. The humane orientation is the degree to which an organization or a society encourages and rewards individuals for being fair and altruistic, friendly, generous, kind, and caring. Again, basically the golden rule, really taking good care of others. All right, and then let's see, the disposition of the followers. Let's see here. The disposition of the followers also has a positive impact, or has a relationship in the context of the culture. So if you have subordinates who are not interested in working with servant leaders, it can be very difficult to implement this style of leadership. On the other hand, when you do have followers who desire it, there are studies that show that servant leadership does have a positive impact on performance and on the behavior of members within that particular organization. Okay, next. As we just discussed some of the characteristics of leadership, these are part of this paradigm, and these do have influence on the relationship and the psychological climate. I showed you the 10 of these from Spear's list. This is just another one of the list, but these are considered essential characteristics. And then at the core of the relationship, really the thing that makes it happen most of all, between the servant leader and the follower, is the leader's belief about the intrinsic value of each person. It's about recognition, acknowledgement, and the realization that each person's abilities are distinct and unique, but yet the person still has something to learn. Leaders who show humility by acknowledging that they don't have all the answers by being true to themselves, and this comes in where Linda was talking about reflection and knowing yourself, but leaders who are true to themselves, who by their interpersonal attitude, they create a working environment where followers feel safe and where they are trusted. These qualities are present in the ideal relationship. Let me go to the next. No, I'm sorry. The qualities that are present are affect. You can see these on the right-hand side of the screen. Affect, which is positive feelings and liking for another. Respect, closely related to feelings of trust and holding the other person in high regard. Contribution is the extent that one perceives the other as working towards shared or common goals. And then finally, loyalty is demonstrated in being faithful and supportive in backing each other. These help create a psychological climate of trust and fairness so that not only is there room for success, but there's also room for mistakes and for learning. Trust enables followers to use their knowledge without fear of repercussion. Now, there is also in this a certain vulnerability to the relationship, both in terms of being exposed, but also in terms of relying on others to contribute to the team and to the effort. All right, if there is this kind of focus on other people, then that will result in fairness toward them. And then because servant leadership is a people-centered leadership style, there is evidence that shows that employees are more satisfied, they are more committed, and actually they're better performing. If you go back to Greenleaf's definition, which I kind of ran through quickly at the beginning here, there were 3 dimensions present there in terms of self-actualization, becoming healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous in terms of positive job attitudes, and in the hope that the followers will become servant leaders themselves. These are the positive outcomes for the organization as well because of the contributions that are made by the people. So the bottom line there is that when the people are made the priority, the organization itself benefits. So in review, servant leadership is a unique approach. It's very different from other forms of leadership, and in a sense it's even counterintuitive because the leader is not, although they are the leader, they are not necessarily the person in charge who has all of the answers. Instead, the focus is first on the followers. Okay? A key component is there is an intrinsic need to help others first. It's essential that followers be open to this style of leadership, and it ultimately results in a positive change for the local community, whether that's the organization or a bit broader, and even societal change. Now, what are some of the positive perspectives of servant leadership? Well, and why may you want to implement it? Number one, it is primarily altruistic. That's the central component. It shares control and gives followers real input in the process. Okay? It must be seen that it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve every problem out there, but it does work best when followers are open to being guided, supported, and empowered. In other words, not given free range to do anything they want, but to truly being guided, supported, empowered, to not have the fear of mistakes and so forth. And then again, there is research that shows that it has positive effects. And I won't give you references to that. I can get them to you if you have an interest in them, but they can be found quite easily online. However, there are also criticisms regarding servant leadership. One is that it doesn't even seem to be leadership because it can be, in a sense, contradictory. The leader is not in charge. The leader is not telling people what to do. At best, it can be seen to be a weak type of leadership. It can also appear a bit idealistic. People say you're building castles in the air. This could never work. I might say build those castles in the air and then work to put the foundations under them. Another big concern is that there can be a negative connotation of the word servant. This is a very culturally biased word, especially if we look at our history. But if we understand it in the context of some of those philosophical quotes that I gave you in the beginning from the Gospels, from the Indian and Chinese philosophers, it maybe has a different sense, although it will take some work with the followers to get them to understand the nature of what we mean by servant. There is a risk of manipulation by followers. If you are one of those people who likes to manage up, in other words, we all manage our bosses now and then, but if the leader is a weak kind of leader, then this could put them at risk to be manipulated by the followers. As I mentioned, even researchers do not have a single consensus on a definition or theoretical framework for servant leadership. An example was the chart I showed you that had all the different characteristics. A lot of commonality, but no single definition. And then the final paragraph, putting others first. Well, what about the bottom line of the company? You know, our purpose here is to go through that funnel, is to fill those seats. That has to be our bottom line, right? How can it work if we're making our people our priority? And you know, servant leadership would argue that it is just the opposite. That if you take care of the people first, then they will take care of the bottom line. So what are some applications of servant leadership? Well, it actually can be used in all levels of management and all types of organization if the characteristics are there, if you have a leader who's willing to employ it, if you have a leader who has some of the prerequisites, if you have followers who are willing to learn servant leadership and willing to take risks with it. It does require a basic positive view of human nature. If you believe that your people are not going to work hard, that they're just out for themselves, then this may not be the right style of leadership for you. But if you believe that people are basically good, they want the success of the organization, this may be the way to help achieve it. It does require a strong humane orientation, which, as we said, is the degree to which an organization encourages and rewards good behavior, kind behavior, generosity, and so forth to others. And it requires a low power distance, a culture where there's less emphasis on formal deference, where there's more decentralized decision-making. And then finally, an organization should be careful to choose people that want to be involved in long-term relationships with their followers, with their leaders who have strong work ethics. And that is my my presentation. Josh, I think you were going to help us with a summary here.
I think Linda was going to actually.
Okay.
I can do that if you'd like.
Well, either way, next slide.
Okay.
And you can help me, Josh, also. If you'd
All
like.
right.
Okay, so what we'd like to do most with our webinars as well as with our educational sessions at conference would be for you to be able to have specific takeaways. So each of us incorporated those types of things into our parts of the presentation, but this is just has some new ones here and some things for you to think about. And so what we would like you to do is choose between 3 and 5 elements from the presentation, set goals, and experiment with these things in your work. We would love to hear from you. If you would like, I know Marcus has the attendance list. We'll probably send out a little note. If you would like to share those things, we'll give one of our contact information, because we would like to kind of follow up on this as well as what we did at the conference with writing some kind of an article on leadership and our members' reactions to what they learned and kind of what they're doing with it. You know, I often, in my role of working with the conference planning committee as well as on the education committee, NAGAP, brought out some of the things that, you know, I did as a high school and junior high teacher for many years, and that is, you know, how do we know our members are learning and taking away with them, and how are they using this new learning? And in a professional organization, that's not always easy to do because membership is spread so far and wide. So we would like to kind of bring that in, and hopefully that will be something that will work for you. The slides kind of went ahead here. So take a look at that list. Most importantly, we would keep a dialogue going. And Josh, did you want to talk about the assessments and the resources?
My slide's not advancing, so unfortunately I don't see.
So it's, you know, just some of the different emotional tests and the leadership inventory, the leadership challenge, the one Cousins and Posner did. So anything that you see here, we will email the PowerPoint presentation to you so that you can have these links. But it would be our advice to you to do some kind of a leadership assessment. The one good thing about the Cousins and Posner one is that it is a 360 test. People that you work with would also and giving about you as a leader. So it's
right. I would just add to the importance of the 360-degree, because remember, as leaders, it's about creating that resonance, creating that ability to influence change and make change, and you can only do that when you can appeal to the needs of others, that help them to understand why they're on board, how make that personal, relationship and connection. So it's important to know how others perceive you, just as much as how you perceive yourself, tying into all of those things. So, yeah, I mean, I think the thing with assessments is that you'll want to do the ones that, really kind of help you to understand. You could do the Myers-Briggs, which is about personality. You could do Strength Quest, which is about you at your best. And you could do some of the assessments from Cousins and Posner. I mean, there's so many things out there. The biggest thing is you're looking for what is the consistent message that you're receiving from all of these, and running with that, not looking to try to compare which one better identifies you over the other, because there's always going to be variance. But if you can identify some of the consistent things, positive or for improvement, that's going to be my recommendation, because there's a lot out there, and you can't necessarily do them all and glean everything from all of them.
Right. Another one that's really a good one. It's a very small book, small in size, and not too many pages, by Tom Rath, R-A-T-H, called Strengths Finder. And when you buy the book, you get to take the test as well. And so we did that on the JGAP, one of the chapters of all the Jesuit schools. Our executive board met every for a retreat and planning session, and we did that as a group. And then we were lucky enough that there was a professor at the Jesuit school who hosted us, which was Regis in Denver, came in and helped us to discern, what the test meant and some elements of leadership. So we were very lucky in that. But then I used it for a staff retreat for the people in my office, and that included the secretaries as well, and it was very, very interesting. And the other thing that we took that year was we all took the MBTI, so we always kept a big chart hanging on somebody's wall in the office, which of the personality types we were, and I think it really helped to bring a better understanding of one another, and, hopefully some people began to see themselves as leaders themselves. Hopefully that was part of our. Did any questions come up on the screen for us?
No, there aren't any questions right now, and given the time, we actually dropped a few attendees and things, so it probably makes sense to wrap up right now, but we appreciate everybody coming to the session, and we'll post the full video of the webinar onto YouTube, and we'll send you a link out as well, and and a link to the slides as well. So if you have any questions for us, you can feel free to follow up, and we'll share your contact information with the panelists, and they may send you a quick follow-up as well. So thank you to all the panelists, and thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you, Marcus, for your support.